Hello, everyone. I am sitting in my library with books around me, wearing a blue blazer with a blue sweater and a blue check shirt. I'm an African-American man with acrylic horn-rimmed glasses. And I want to welcome you to a special occasion where I have an opportunity to talk to a very dear friend of mine. His name is Charles Blow, and he has written a book that is disrupting normative thought about politics, race, and power in America. It is a Black manifesto, he calls it. I want to thank Charles for writing The Devil You Know. It is a great contribution to this moment in our country of racial reckoning, of addressing the issues of inequality, white supremacy. So welcome, Charles Blow. Hello, Charles.
Hi. So my name is Charles Blow. I'm a Black man with a salt and pepper beard. I have on a dark gray suit, white shirt, orange tie. I'm sitting in front of a black brick wall that is covered with very large posters of the cover of my book, The Devil You Know.
Welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
So, Charles, you and I have known each other for some time, and so we're going to really keep this like a regular book interview. And we'll save the Charles and Darren.
Impossible.
So Charles, let me ask you, why is it you write what you call the most audacious power play by Black America in the history of this country? The Devil You Know calls for a radical shift in our politics, in our geography. Why was it necessary for you to write this book now?
Well, I believe that a lot of the things that are plaguing Black America stem from a lack of power, and this was a path to that power. At the end of the Civil War, 3 Southern states were majority Black, and another 3 were within 3 percentage points of being majority Black. In fact, every Southern state had very large Black populations because 90% of Black people in America lived in the American South up until 1910, 1916 or so. And during Reconstruction, that was after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which gave Black people citizenship, and after the passage of the 15th Amendment that guaranteed at least Black men the right to vote. In many of those Southern states, the majority of the registered voters was Black. And that meant something. So during Reconstruction in places like Mississippi, they sent large delegations of Black people to state houses. Those delegates, at least in Mississippi, went to their white counterparts and said, we have 2 Senate seats open when we are readmitted to the Union. One of those has to be Black. And that was what power looked like. And one of them was made to be a Black man. And in fact, Mississippi gives us our first 2 Black senators in American history. They were not popularly elected at the point they were appointed by state legislatures, but because Black people had sent such large delegations to the state legislature, they were able to make that demand. That is what power looks like. Can you, by the power of your vote in a state, not adding to a coalition, but being the driving force of a coalition or being the majority of that coalition, demand inclusion? Can you deliver a state? Can you then, by being the majority of a state, write criminal code for that state? Can you look at incarceration and make sure that it does not become mass incarceration that disproportionately affects people who look like you? That's what power looks like. Black people, because we are fanned out across America, the majority in no state, simply do not have access to that power.
And so your prescription is that I leave the confines of my comfortable apartment on the east side of New York and move back home to Rain, Louisiana?
I'm going to include myself in the Darren boat and say migrations are never about men of a certain age or women of a certain age. They're always about young people. Migrations, voluntary migrations, are always led by the younger, less encumbered people who can basically make a life anywhere, and they're choosing to make a life in a place for a particular reason. Very often it is economic reasons, but it can also be political reasons. It can be comfort. It can be a sense of belonging, but they can make those choices. And so for people who are well-established where you are, captains of industry in whatever industry you're in, and you feel nurtured and you feel that you are not just a seasoning, a spice in that culture, but essential to that culture, and you feel safe, more importantly, and that your family is safe in that space, stay there. But if you have looked at all of these killings of young Black men, most of the high profile cases being in what I call destination cities, the destinations of people who migrated during the Great Migration, like we're seeing the case of George Floyd right now. If that is your reality, and you don't want that to be your reality, you don't want to have to march again and every time. And we've been marching in this way since the killing of Trayvon Martin. And very few of those people, those officers are charged or convicted because it is actually legal for them to kill people the way that they're killing them, because they're insulated in that way. And that is all, that is largely state law. If that doesn't feel right to you, and you want a path to power that says, I want enough power that I don't have to plead to whiteness, which is what all that protest is. I don't have to plead to whiteness to change it. I can just change it.
And so you are suggesting, and let's go back then to some of the many revelations in this book that I think are quite fresh and was unknown to many of us. So the idea of white supremacy, which you describe in detail in your book, I've had experience in talking about this idea of white supremacy. And I once had someone say, a white conservative friend in Texas who I rely on and who's a good friend, who said, Darren, talking about white supremacy is a turnoff. You're not going to really engage white people in these ideas that you've sort of conjured up as a way to describe the circumstance that we're in now. Now, you actually make the argument that the idea of white supremacy didn't come from the Ford Foundation or liberals, that it actually is rooted in a very real political history.
Absolutely. Here's the thing. I think modern people, conservatives and some liberals as well, believe that white supremacy is the new catchphrase. But if you go back and read, as I have, the minutes of the constitutional conventions of the 1890s, where state after state in the South was calling constitutional conventions to literally write white supremacy into the DNA of those states, it's the term they used. It's not new at all. And I was shocked by how many times they used the phrase white supremacy, that we are here to write white supremacy into the law over and over and over. Even the letters they got in support of the conventions were included in the minutes. And everybody was saying the same thing. We are here to write white supremacy into the code. It is not new. And so for modern Americans, white people included, to say, oh my God, you guys have to stop talking about this. No, we don't. It is foundational. It is literally the phrase that was used to establish itself. even before those constitutions. And if you look back when Lincoln was debating Douglas, he didn't use the word white supremacy, but he used a variation of it. He said, "For I, as much as any man, believes that there must be an inferior and superior position among the races, and I believe the white people should have the superior position." That's white supremacy. Black people didn't make this up.
Well, I think the challenge today, of course, is it's a context that is very racially fraught. It's racially fraught because many whites feel that inequality is making it harder for white Americans too. And that the idea of white privilege, you know, if you're a low-wage, working class white man in Ohio, and he's sitting there listening to Charles Blow talk about his privilege, the white man's privilege, he's looking at Charles Blow and saying, if anybody's got privilege here, it's you, not me. I'm without privilege. I'm the one who's vulnerable economically and most likely to be harmed by what's happening with outsourcing and all of these things. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me say two things. Number one is the beauty of this book and the beauty of the exercise of writing it is that it did not center whiteness at all. It doesn't care about your feelings, right? If you feel a particular way or I feel a particular way, it doesn't care about my feelings. This is about power. This is about access to power. And this is about a path to power that Black people can take that doesn't require convincing white people of anything, changing their minds about anything, helping them to grow out of racism in any way. Have it your way. We've done that for 400 years, trying to cajole and ask people for growth and having Black liberation contingent or dependent on your evolution. And this plan doesn't require that. It just says Black people can move on their own.
But wouldn't you also say?
But I just want to say this, and then and then to the particulars of that issue, white privilege is not about whether or not you overcome your obstacles or not. The white privilege is about whether or not there are obstacles in your way to overcome. There are Black people in America, white, Asian people, Hispanic people who overcome the obstacles that are placed in their way that are not placed in the way of their white brothers. There are white brothers who don't have the same obstacles, but also don't have success, who also suffer. That doesn't mean that white privilege does not exist. It just means that our relationship to overcoming or having to deal with it has all been different because of our efforts, because of luck, because of any number of things in our lives.
So you have departed Brooklyn for Atlanta. And I am curious because the results of the election there, which of course, dear Stacey Abrams and particularly Black women organizing was essential, and that win would not have happened. But there had to be alliances with whites. Black people alone didn't win that election. There were white progressives, white suburbanites who, according to the polling, had never voted for a Democrat. And so how do you think about this notion? I mean, you're saying, I don't care about your feelings and we don't need you. I mean, at the end of the day, in a multiracial democracy, how do you?
When I say I don't care, I'm saying I'm not centering your feelings. I believe that personal growth is important to celebrate. Anybody who doesn't want to be racist anymore, you should do that for you. I don't want to be in a position where I'm like, my liberation is dependent on this person coming out of a cave. I don't want that. I want you to want to come out of a cave because it's light outside. I want you to not be racist because it is anti-science and anti-historical. I do not, however, want to be dependent on that growth, which is what position Black people have been in order to have power in this country. So that is what I'm saying when I say it's not your feeling. I'm saying not that I don't care about a person's individual feelings. It is that I do not believe that your feelings are central to the argument that Black people are making about power. Number two is, you said, about me moving to Atlanta. What Darren is not going to tell you is when I told Darren this, he said, what? So that.
Thank you, Carl. I don't think that the audience is really interested in my response.
Yes, that was his shocked reaction.
The crazy idea that you were leaving New York. We really don't need to go there right now.
So the other thing I want to talk about is Georgia, which is fascinating. Because on the one hand, what happened was what Stacey and all the other organizers did on the ground, which was they've been organizing. Some people have been organizing for decades. This latest push in organizing was relatively recent, but it really worked. But the other shoe was reverse migration. The Black population of Georgia doubled from 1990 to 2020, from 1.7 million people to now over 3.4 million people. Black people, when last time that Georgia went for a Democrat was in 1992 for Bill Clinton, but Black people were not the majority of that coalition because they were only 25% of the population of Georgia. This year, they were 33% of the population of Georgia. And if you believe the exit polls, that makes them the majority of the coalition that delivered this state, not only for Joe Biden, but also it was the first time in the entire history of the Senate that Black people were the majority of a coalition that elected a US senator. And they didn't just elect one, they elected two. And that is the difference. When you become the majority of the coalition, it doesn't mean that there are not people in the coalition with you. It's that you are the driver of that coalition. And that changes the way people look at you and consider power in relation to you. That is the difference between you being in Georgia and being instrumental and you being in Pennsylvania or Michigan and being instrumental. Because in Pennsylvania, you're 11, 12, maybe 15% of the population. They only need you to come in when white people basically split down the middle and you need to break the tie, right? That doesn't mean, but when you don't do that, they don't come to you and say, oh my God, the Black people didn't show. Let's create policies that will encourage Black people to come out and vote and make them enthusiastic about that voting. Because if they had done that in 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost, they would have come to the Black people and said that. But they did not. For 2 years, the only thing that we heard was how do we get back white working class voters, because those were the majority of that coalition. That's what the majority of the coalition looks like. That's the power it garners you.
So when you think practically then about implementing your radical idea, how many states are we talking about? We're still only talking about, what, 2 states, 3 states, where Blacks will be the majority if we all move home?
When you say that with such derision. So no, I identified 9 states, right? So these are all states where Black people are already 25% or more of the population. That is, they're stretched along the I-20 up the I-95 corridor. That's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. People don't think of Delaware as a southern state, but the census always has, and so do I. Delaware is also the 8th Blackest state in America. People don't always realize that, and it's tiny. It doesn't take a lot of people to change that to a majority Black state. Anyway, so all of those states are prime, and they're good. And I like the idea of having a variety of states because they appeal to different kinds of people. There's people who want to be near the water on the coast. I don't think that's smart in an environment where global warming is leading to sea level rise. But if that is a thing that is important to somebody, that's very much possible. If you are part of the tech industry and you want to be in a tech corridor, there is one in the Virginia area. If you are in the auto industry in Detroit, and you want to move south, where in the last 20, maybe 30, I think definitely 20 years, all the foreign automakers have located their factories in southern cities. So there's just a lot of reasons and a lot of variety of ways, places that people can be, in addition to the option of going to a homestead, which is where your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents are actually from.
You talk about the story of the change in Vermont, which was really an interesting one. Talk about how that informed your book.
So it was kind of the spark of it because when this came into my consciousness, I just wasn't aware of it, as I think some of my readers may not be aware of it. In 1992, I think it was, two Yale law students write a paper in the Yale Law Review called Jamestown 70, and it was coming on the heels of a lot of protests, anti-Vietnam War protests, against the way the Nixon administration was executing the war, but the Nixon administration kept executing it the way they wanted to, and all these young hippies were frustrated by this. And these young law students say, you may want a revolution, but you're not going to have it the way you want to have it. But one thing you can do is this thing we call radical federalism, which is you basically just take over a state. And I think they pointed to Vermont in the paper. A more prominent writer picks up this paper after it languishes, this minor little paper, languishes there. And the next year writes an article in Playboy under the headline, which is something like "Take Over Vermont," something like that, and lays out the math, how many people it would take. And tens of thousands of young white hippies mostly from the Northeast pick up their things and move to Vermont. It is, part of it is for social freedom, but part of it is also for this idea of creating a new reality, political reality. And they're not, and people always say, well, what do you mean it would be hard to move? Well, they moved without having a place to live or a job waiting for them. They just did it. And they changed Vermont from one of the most conservative states in America to now it is one of the most liberal states in the union. It is the place in 2008 where Barack Obama received his largest percentage of the white vote. It produces senators like Bernie Sanders. They basically changed Vermont from New Hampshire into Vermont.
And so you think the lesson is, if we do that in Delaware, that we could in Delaware have a Vermont-like situation for Black people?
Yes, the lesson is, number one, it's doable, infinitely doable. Number two, it's perfectly legal. Number three, it did not require them to send a majority, to take over majority. Just the infusion of enough young revolutionary radical energy changed Vermont. They didn't move in numbers enough to take over the state. It was just the infusion of the energy. And so my thought is, I believe that you could reach majority, but even short of majority, the infusion of tremendous activist, young, vibrant energy can have a huge effect on transforming the politics of a state.
So you also know the data around our electoral college system and the demographics and the projections. Something in the range of 15 states will be where most people of color in America live. The other 35 states, which will be primarily white, and in terms of at least a presidential election, will still maintain, in some ways, an over-indexing, right, of power. That, so your plan, how would your plan deal with that reality of demographics and our electoral college system?
Right. So basically, if you're moving back to the South, the electoral college system, and in some ways the Senate itself, uses slavery against Black people. Right. It gave the enslavers power by virtue of the enslaved being in their space. This basically uses these systems against the system itself. You know, if Black people had not migrated during the Great Migration, it is possible that they could control more electoral college votes than New York State and California combined. Right? If Hillary Clinton had simply won in the general election, the southern states with these large Black delegations, large Black populations that she won in the primaries, she could have lost every single Midwestern swing state and still been president of the United States.
So that would have been the incentive. We all moved home to elect Hillary Clinton president.
Not exactly. I want to be very clear when I say Black power. I'm not saying party power, Democratic Party, Republican Party, or anything. It is power of self-determination. It is power to put pressure on political systems so that they are more responsive to Black people. That when they are negotiating and compromising, that the first people that they offer up are not always Black people in that compromise. Which has been the history of America, even
that
among the
African
liberals,
have been the population most compromised.
Yes,
offered.
Whenever there's a compromise to be had, it is Black people who are given away in that compromise. The reason that Reconstruction is allowed to fail is because they have a compromise over who's going to be allowed to be president during that contested election. And they basically say to the Southerners basically say, you can have the presidency as long as you get all these troops out of the South, which everybody knew what that was going to mean.
Well, and this is to this idea that the North won the Civil War, but the South actually won the narrative.
Well, there's a historian who I quote in the book who says the North won the Civil War in 1865, but the South won it in 1890. Because it was in 1890 that Mississippi becomes the first state to call a constitutional convention to write Jim Crow, white supremacy into its constitution. And every single Southern state after that calls a constitutional convention to follow what they call the Mississippi example. So basically, you got rid of enslavement in 1865, and the South reconstituted it beginning in 1890.
So when you talk about the South, we Southerners, Black Southerners, grow up with what you describe as to be a sort of a trauma history. Talk about this idea of trauma history and the kind of history you imagine.
Well, I don't think that that's a Southern history. I think that is an American Black experience. Is that that our trauma history is substituted for our total history, and a lot of that trauma at this moment is not coming from the South at all, but from destination cities. But what I think that is necessary, in addition to political power, is that you need a space in which you can explore the human possibilities that are embedded in every human. Here's the thing about me, I agree with the American Anthropological Association. Race, as we have defined it, doesn't even exist. It is racism that's real. If you remove all the obstacles that we put in front of some people and remove all the advantages that we give to other people, human beings will behave like human beings. Some will create things, some will destroy things. Some will be honorable and great and brilliant, and some will be scoundrels. There will be crime among others, and there will be philanthropy among others. This is just how human beings will behave without these constructs that we put on them. What I want for Black people is what white people have enjoyed in this country. The possibility of just to dream and know that everything is possible for you and that there's nothing put in front of you to limit those possibilities.
So we're going to go to questions in a moment, but before we do that, Charles Blow, you have a number of things happening in the Charles Blow universe that I'm sure our audience would love to know about. Terrence Blanchard has commissioned a brilliant opera. Would you share that opera with us?
Oh, okay. So Terrence Blanchard, yes, you're right, brilliant. A composer, has turned my first book, Fire Sharpen Your Bones, into an opera. It premiered the year before last in St. Louis, and when the Met in New York reopens, it will reopen with that opera. It will be the first opera by a Black composer in the history of the Met, and I believe only the second opera with an all-Black cast, the first one being Porgy and Bess.
Mm. And do you have any television activity?
So I have, beginning next month, I will anchor a 10 p.m. news show titled to be announced on an upstart network called the Black News Channel. I always tell people like, why would you do that? And I said, at this point in my life, I truly believe that my voice is most valuable in a Black space. And and with this, Toni Morrison spoke about this idea about her writing and a critique of it, and someone saying you would only be an adult once you, as a writer, when you are able to move out of just write about Black people and write about white people and have them be central characters. And she said, that this is basically people writing for white people through the white gaze, that they explaining things that don't need to be explained to her, and that's how she knew that they weren't talking to her. They were talking to some editor who said, I don't understand that, explain it, right? And that the whole question wasn't serious, because Shakespeare wasn't writing to Black people, and nobody would ever ask him to do it. And I can read those books and those plays and enjoy them, knowing full well that he had no concept that a Black person would ever read his work.
Shakespeare felt that his work was universal.
Why can a play about all white people be universal and a book about all Black people not be? And so that's what I'm saying. I want to be able to do the same thing that Toni did with her books and say, let me look at the news through this Black gaze. And what is important if I see it in that way? And why can't that also be universal?
Well, on that note, my esteemed colleague, Sierra, is going to monitor the questions. And I am sure there are many. I see already there are 13. Well, Sierra, I'm going to let you go at it with Charles.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Charles. So the first question is, if large swaths of African Americans congregate in a few southern states, does that open other states to even greater oppression of its Black constituents who are now less numerically significant and therefore less of a factor in political elections and social interactions?
Well, I think that right now, Black people are the minority in every single state. If you say do nothing, we're basically saying that that's perfectly fine, right? The degree of your freedom is dependent on the majority of that state, which right now in every state except Hawaii is white people. Only if they agree that we should change our policing will it happen. Only if they agree that we should change mass incarceration and the criminal justice system will that happen. You are always now in a position of pleading. I believe that you should have space in this country where pleading is not the only power that you have.
Thank you. And to follow up on that, why force the burden of a movement on the young, already starving for capital, time, and their young families? Isn't there a stronger case to be made for people in the third age of life to lead a 21st century liberation of Black power? They can bring their resources, organizing experience, and time to communities that need a diversity of viewpoints to accelerate and cement a commitment to change.
I'm going to go back to the answer that I just gave, right? In the entire history of the United States, let me just say this statement first. Right now, the whole conversation around power is about centering whiteness, particularly white men, particularly wealthy white men. In the entire history of this country, one president has not been a white man. In the entire history of this country, one vice president has not been a white man. The majority of the Supreme Court is white men. The majority of the federal bench is white men. There are now 4 governors in America who are not white, and none of them are Black. 50% of all state houses right now are white men. Another 30% are white women. 15% are the rest of the racial groups. If you actually had power right now, the things that you are protesting about would have been done already, because you could do them. These white men have decided that that's not what they want. And so all of the protesting is about pressuring or convincing or shaming these white men into recognizing Black equality and Black humanity. I simply refuse to believe that that is a position that Black people must take for the rest of their time in this country. And in fact, that is why this book is written, because there is a path to power that does not go through that.
Thank you for that. Another question, sort of piggybacking off of that. Black people are the minority in every state, but the majority in many major cities. Why not take a local power approach versus a state-based approach? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Yes, there are no cities or cities or towns in the Constitution. As far as the Constitution is concerned, cities and towns exist at the behest of the state. The Constitution splits power in this country between the federal government and states. In fact, it specifically says that all power not specifically granted to the federal government in this document are reserved for the states. That means that whatever the cities want to do can be preempted by the state. It means that criminal code is mostly written by the state. It means that the vast majority of incarceration is a state and then local issue. You have to have state power in order to be a real player in the politics of this country. If I live here in Atlanta, if Keisha Lance Bottom says coronavirus is out of control, we need to have stricter measures to control it, she can say that all she wants. But anything that the city wants to do can be preempted by the state, because that's where constitutionally the real power lands. Furthermore, elections are governed by states. If you want to make sure that voter disenfranchisement is not an issue, you have to do that on a state level. If you want to make sure that people are not using gerrymandering to lessen the impact and import of Black voter, you have to do that on a state level. States level is where the power is, and you can have it. And it doesn't matter that you're only 14% of the population of this country. Right now, there are 6 or 7 states where the white population is 90+% of the population. But right now, there are 4 times as many Black people in America as the entire population of those 7 states combined. Those 7 states basically account for 4% or so of the US population. And yet they control 1 out of every 6 Senate seats in America. The size of your population is less important. The geography of your population is primarily important.
Sierra.
Thank you. And there's a few questions about your move to Atlanta. So I'm going to combine them. A lot of folks are saying they're very glad you moved to Atlanta. They relocated from New York to Atlanta and ended up staying longer than they expected. So 2 questions here. One, how have you connected with your new home? Are there any meaningful relationships with community-based organizations that you've found? And what are your best recommendations for making the progress made in 2020 into a continued movement instead of just a moment, especially what happened in Atlanta this year or last year?
Well, I moved in the middle of the pandemic. So, so that, like getting a true sense of a new city or becoming part of the social fabric of the city is just difficult. So I'll reserve judgment on that because everything changed this year. That said, this idea of whether or not what happened in Georgia is permanent or fleeting, people don't move every year in and out of state. So people who've made the decision of the last 3 decades to move to Atlanta or to Georgia or to any other southern states, that's not a decision that people are willing to reverse on a dime. Will there, this is a revolutionary thing that I'm asking people to do. There's no such thing as a revolutionary act without risk and without resistance. There will be tremendous resistance to what is happening here in Georgia. In fact, the state legislature has something like 40 plus bills that they're trying to pass, and some, at least one has passed, to restrict voting, to try to turn the tide, to try to craft an electorate to their liking, rather than the one that turned the state. So you're going to have that. What I'm saying to Black people is, if you're averse to risk, if you believe that it should be easy for you to access power, the revolutionary acts are easy, this is not for you. Stay where you are. March every time a Black person is gunned down in the streets, and then watch as his killer walks free. But if that is not what you want, there's another fight.
Charles, may I just say, you presume that what will then be created in these new found fully empowered Black geographies is some sort of Black utopia, where there won't be police killings of Black people, where there won't be certain communities who still feel left out and left behind?
No, I explicitly don't make that presumption. If white majorities if racial majorities produce utopias, then every white person in America will be living in a utopia, because every state in America except Hawaii has been majority white for the last 90 years. But they are not. White people, just like any other people, still face crime, still face income inequality, still face food insecurity. Those 7 states that I mentioned before, where 90+% of the population is white, surely all of those white people are living in utopia. They are not. They still face the same issues of the human condition. What I am saying, however, is that on the aggregate, people who do not have to suffer under white supremacy do better than those who do.
Sierra.
And to follow up on that, there's a couple of questions about this. People generally migrate for economic reasons. What makes you think they will move for political reasons that would be predicted on huge numbers of people migrating to make a difference? The Great Migration took about 60 years. How many years do you think it would take to turn Southern states to majority Black voters?
Well, I am also making the argument that Black people should move from many of these destination cities for economic reasons, because the Black middle class in the Southern states is thriving. When Forbes does his list of where the Black middle class is thriving, those are largely Southern cities. People think that because they live in the shadow of prosperity, that they share that prosperity. When in fact, the Black poverty rate in New York City is higher than the Black poverty rate in Mississippi. Now, maybe you can figure out some way to scratch a survival out of $17,000 in Mississippi. There's no way you can do that in Manhattan. I looked at the second quarter unemployment at the height of the pandemic, not at the height of the deaths and hospitalization, but at the height of our response, meaning that period when we closed everything. And that was the second quarter of last year. The Black unemployment rate in Illinois triple. No, sorry, in Chicago, triple the Black unemployment rate in Atlanta. People assume that to move to a Southern city is to give up economically, when in fact the inverse is true. That these Black people in Southern cities are thriving. The counties with the wealthiest Black populations in America are several counties outside of DC on the Maryland side. And that is in the South.
So you're saying that for all of us who feel a little economic security, who live in these big northern cities, for the vast majority, while we've got this little mirage going, most Blacks would do much better by moving south economically.
It is just the Black poverty and unemployment rates in these destination cities is a staggeringly high figure. And when you go from just regular poverty, already, like I said before, New York City's Black poverty rate is higher than Mississippi's. If you look at concentrated poverty, now concentrated poverty is when a community has a poverty rate of over 40%, which has a cascading number of ill effects, because it means that not only are you poor, everybody you know basically is poor. When you look at the top 10 places where this is an issue, Southern cities don't even show it. There's one in Tennessee on that entire list. These are all destination cities.
The destination of many Blacks who moved north.
Yes, that is where concentrated poverty exists.
So we only have time for one more question. A lot of people said that they loved your focus on what Black people can do, not depending on white people waking up, and moving to the South is definitely one step there. So 2 questions here. Can you list some other things that Black people can do to focus on their own empowerment? And as a white male, what is your expectation, request, and demand of this audience and the folks on the line today?
So I'll say this to white people, because I believe, again, I'm gonna say this again. I don't believe in race. I just believe that we created racism. We created these weird categories based on the way people look, and we created a system of oppression and privileges based on those appearances. So I say live your life as if that doesn't exist in that way. but respect the cultures that grew out of that system, right? So there is a Black culture in America that grew out of that oppression and also out of their history and connection to Africa. It is musical, it is food or whatever. Respect that. But at the same time, on an individual level, I applaud anyone who wants to grow and is growing in their walk towards egalitarianism, racial egalitarianism. It is just that I do not want you to believe, nor will I ever believe, that your walk and how well you do on that walk is what will deliver me as a Black person out of this circumstance. That there is something that we can do on our own that can do this. Because centering whiteness in this discussion of Black liberation has always been problematic, remains problematic, and also reinforces the imbalance and the weakness that Black people have as it pertains to power in this country. I do not want that.
Well, I think, Charles Blow, you have fulfilled and exceeded the expectations, I am sure, of everyone watching today's program. You have once again, Charles, written a great book, a New York Times bestseller. One final question from me. Are you hopeful, Charles Blow, about America?
I believe that America, there has always been two camps in the Black liberation argument. One believes, as Dr. King did, that America is sick, is in need of healing. And the other believing that what ailed America was terminal and could never be fixed. I have one foot in both camps. I believe that the system of power allows a path that can be used. It is not designed to liberate Black people. It was in fact designed to oppress them, but in fact can be flipped on its head and used as a system of liberation. You can allow white supremacy can be consumed by its own fire. On the other hand, I believe that the racial question in America, and when I say racial question, I mean white supremacy and anti-Blackness. You have to include anti-Blackness in that equation. Shows no sign of a final and complete eradication. And so that part, I believe, is terminal.
Well, then you leave us, Charles, with a dilemma. And that is, in fact, the dilemma of the American narrative. A dilemma, a narrative that is both informed by some of the most valiant, courageous, noble ideas of democracy, equality, justice, opportunity, these almost imaginary, but very real ideas that exist not just in our imagination, but exist in our lived experience with the reality of racial hierarchy and this artificial delineation of humanity based on skin color that continues, as de Tocqueville said about America, that it ultimately would be the challenge that America would never overcome. I, like you, believe that both of those camps have legitimacy, but ultimately we have to be committed to the journey of this experiment called America and making it realize its potential. So Charles Blow, thank you for being with us today. We are smarter, more knowledgeable, more informed, more inspired as a result of this conversation. And we are grateful that you wrote The Devil You Know.
Thank you, Darren.
To the audience, our friends, our colleagues, thank you so much for joining us on this occasion. And I look forward to, in just a few weeks, interviewing the author Julia Swag and her new book on hiding in plain sight, Lady Bird Johnson, one of my sheroes, on Thursday, April 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. Until then, thank you. Have a great day.